During his morning patrol, an officer noticed a strange object on the side of the road. Approaching it, he realized that it was a new, perfectly clean coffin. But as soon as he opened the lid, everything around him changed dramatically, and he was forced to call the feds immediately. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The first pale light of morning was only beginning to touch the horizon when Officer Daniel Hale guided his patrol SUV along the long, desolate stretch of highway that connected two border states. The road was almost empty at this hour, the darkness softened but not banished by the dim glow of dawn. A heavy fog hung low over the asphalt, swallowing up the view ahead in a dense, ghostly curtain. The headlights pushed through in two narrow cones, revealing only a short stretch of road at a time, while everything beyond melted into shifting gray. The steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on the seams in the pavement were the only sounds accompanying him through the quiet. Daniel was a man who had come to trust the instincts honed over years in uniform. At 42, with a deep brown complexion, a strong jaw, and a steady gaze, he had the calm air of someone who had faced more than his share of dangerous situations and come through them intact. He had served in the Army before joining the Highway Patrol 15 years earlier, and though the desert roads seemed far removed from the conflicts he had once known overseas, they had their own hazards. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. He'd seen how the seemingly empty highways could carry the worst of humanity under the cover of night. This morning had started like so many others. His shift was almost over, and the thought of heading home to his modest house on the outskirts of town crossed his mind as he sipped the last of the lukewarm coffee from a dented travel mug. He was used to the monotony of these dawn drives, long, straight miles with only the occasional trucker or early commuter. But he also knew that monotony was deceptive. Trouble often chose the quietest moments to show itself. The fog clung to the earth as if it were alive, wrapping around the base of the roadside shrubs and swallowing up the distant silhouettes of telephone poles. Visibility was so limited that Daniel kept his speed a little lower than usual, scanning the edges of the road more carefully. Years of training and experience had taught him to notice things most drivers ignored: a fresh tire track cutting into the dirt, a discarded piece of clothing, a glint of metal where there shouldn't be any. He didn't know what he was looking for until he saw it. At first, it was only a vague, elongated shape on the far left shoulder, half concealed behind a cluster of dry bushes. It might have been a pile of construction debris or an old appliance, but something about its proportions caught his attention. The shape seemed deliberate, the straight lines too clean for a random heap. More than that, it was the way it sat, positioned not in the haphazard way trash was usually dumped, but placed there, as though someone had taken care to arrange it. Daniel slowed his vehicle and eased over toward the shoulder, letting the SUV roll to a stop several yards away. His hand went instinctively to the dash to activate the overhead flashers, bathing the fog in pulsing red and blue light. In the shifting mist, the shape seemed to breathe, its contours coming in and out of focus. He stepped out, the cold morning air biting at his skin, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. The boots of his uniform crunched softly on the gravel as he approached. The thing was covered by a large tarpaulin, dull green in the dim light, its edges pinned down with chunks of rock. He circled it slowly, his eyes sweeping the area for tire impressions or footprints. There were faint indentations in the dirt leading from the road, as though a heavy object had been dragged here from a larger vehicle. The bushes nearby were bent and broken, and a few snapped twigs bore fresh marks, the pale wood beneath the bark exposed to the air. Daniel crouched to lift one edge of the tarp, but paused. His other hand rested loosely on the grip of his sidearm, a habit formed not from paranoia, but from survival. Out here, an officer could stumble onto anything: drug shipments, stolen goods, even bodies. Whatever was under that tarp, someone had gone to some trouble to hide it. When he finally peeled the cover back, his breath caught. Beneath the tarp lay a coffin. The morning light, weak and diffused through the fog, glinted faintly off its polished mahogany surface. The deep reddish-brown wood looked freshly lacquered, unmarred by dust or the weathering one would expect from something left outdoors. Gold-toned handles gleamed in the cold light, and the decorative trim along the sides was unscathed, as though it had been made, or at least cleaned, only recently. It was such an incongruous sight that for a moment he simply stared at it, trying to make sense of its presence here. Coffins weren't left by the roadside. They were expensive, personal, and, above all, private. To see one dumped like an abandoned refrigerator was unsettling in a way that went beyond the strangeness of the object itself. Daniel stepped back and let his eyes roam the surrounding area again. No other debris, no discarded flowers or funeral wrappings, just this single, pristine coffin, placed where few would see it unless they were looking closely. He felt the small muscles in his neck tighten as his mind began to process the possibilities. It could be stolen property from a mortuary transport, or maybe part of some botched smuggling attempt, or, worst of all, it might still contain a body. A stronger gust of wind pushed through the fog, tugging at the loose edge of the tarp and lifting it higher. Daniel grabbed it and tossed it fully aside, letting the coffin rest in the open. He could see now that the surface wasn't entirely perfect. Faint scratches marked the lid, and there were shallow dents along one side. Most telling of all were the hinges. Thick, clumsy welds had been added to them, sealing the lid more securely than any standard coffin would require. The metal was still a little discolored from the heat of the torch. The sight stirred something deep in his gut. He had seen welded-shut containers before, usually in drug seizures or weapons trafficking busts. The purpose was always the same: keep people from opening them without the right tools, slow them down if they tried. That detail, combined with the coffin's pristine condition, pushed the situation out of the realm of the ordinary and into something far more serious. Daniel's mind raced through his options. He could call it in immediately, wait for backup, and secure the scene. That was procedure. But procedure also meant involving the department right away, and in his years on the job, he had learned that not everyone in uniform could be trusted. Corruption had a way of creeping into the most unlikely places, and if this was what he suspected, word would spread fast. Too fast. He took a slow breath, eyes fixed on the polished wood, the gleaming handles, the strange, ugly welds. Somewhere out in the fog, the road stretched on, silent and empty, but Daniel knew that silence didn't last forever. Whoever had left this here might come back, and if they did, he needed to be ready. For the moment, he stood still, listening to the faint hum of his SUV's engine behind him, the whisper of wind through the bushes, and the quiet, insistent thump of his own heartbeat. The coffin waited, mute and impenetrable, holding its secrets just beyond his reach. In that stillness, Daniel understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was inside was not meant to be found. When he stepped closer again, his boots sinking slightly into the soft shoulder, he felt the fog closing in tighter, the light growing dimmer despite the advancing morning. He laid his fingertips gently on the lid, the polished surface cool beneath his gloves, and knew that whatever path he chose next would carry him far from the simple monotony of a routine dawn patrol. Something had shifted on this lonely stretch of highway, and he was at the center of it now, whether he wanted to be or not. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon one last time before turning back to the Coffin. The fog had swallowed everything beyond the immediate few yards, creating a pocket of isolation around him. He reached for the small flashlight clipped to his belt, its beam a pale spear against the dense mist, and leaned forward to study the welds more closely. Fresh, imperfect, done in a hurry, but strong enough to keep the lid shut against casual tampering. Whoever had done this had skill with a torch, but little time to waste. The air felt heavier now, as if the scene itself resisted being disturbed. He thought again about calling it in, about the chain of custody, about the inevitable flood of questions and the possibility of answers he might not survive long enough to hear. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. He had found this, and that meant the responsibility for uncovering the truth, at least the first layer of it, was his. Daniel took one last sip from his coffee, set the empty cup on the hood of the SUV, and made his decision. Whatever lay inside this coffin, he would find out for himself before anyone else could touch it. The fog thickened around him as if in response, wrapping the highway in an almost soundless shroud. In the dim light, the coffin's polished surface seemed to draw him closer, pulling him into the heart of a mystery that had just begun to unfold. He didn't know yet that this moment, the quiet decision made in the stillness of a fog-bound morning, was the first step into a chain of events that would change everything he thought he knew about his job, his department, and the people he worked alongside. For now, there was only the coffin, the fog, and the gnawing certainty that he was about to open a door that could never be closed again. Daniel stood over the coffin, the polished wood now bare beneath the pale, struggling daylight, the tarp crumpled in the dirt beside it. The fog swirled lazily, curling around the base of the casket as if trying to hide it again, to pull it back into obscurity. He had not moved for nearly a minute, his breath steady but deeper now, every instinct telling him that what lay before him was no accident. Out on this isolated stretch of highway, miles from any town or cemetery, the presence of a pristine coffin was more than just out of place. It was a question, one wrapped in the unsettling certainty that whoever put it here had not wanted it to be found. He stepped closer, his boots crunching over the damp gravel, and allowed his eyes to run slowly along the coffin's length. The wood was dark, a rich reddish brown, the sheen of recent polish still clinging to its surface. The corners were sharp and undamaged, the gold-toned handles gleaming faintly, untouched by dirt or weather. Even the decorative trim along the sides seemed perfect, its intricate pattern unmarred. It was as if the thing had been carried straight from a showroom floor and set down here only hours ago. That pristine condition alone made it wrong. The road dust, the grit of the desert air, even the dew that clung to every other surface around them, it was absent here. The coffin was too clean, almost sterile, and that incongruity made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Bending slightly, Daniel let his gaze settle on the lid. That was where the illusion broke. The surface bore marks, not the random scuffs of age or careless handling, but fresh scratches, shallow but deliberate. The finish was chipped in places where something sharp had scraped across it. His eyes narrowed as he moved to the side, where the truth was even more apparent. The hinges were wrong. He had seen enough coffins during his years in the service and later in law enforcement to know the typical hardware: smooth, machined, discreet. These hinges had been tampered with, replaced or reinforced by crude welding. The weld beads were uneven, thick, and had left behind small splatters of scorched metal. Whoever had done it had worked quickly, sealing the lid in a way that went far beyond what any mortuary or funeral service would consider normal. The faint, acrid scent of burned steel still lingered in the damp air, and Daniel realized the modification could have been done within the last day or two. He crouched lower, letting his gloved hand hover just over the seam where the lid met the body. The welds were functional, not aesthetic. They were meant to hold fast, to prevent easy access, to keep the contents hidden until the right tools or the right person came along. He had seen that kind of sealing before, though never on something meant to hold a body. Smugglers used it for drug compartments, traffickers for weapons caches, sometimes even for moving cash. The fact that it was a coffin, however, was calculated. A coffin was the kind of container people didn't want to inspect too closely. It inspired discomfort, respect, or even fear. That alone made it perfect for concealment. Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding brush again. No tire tracks were visible on the asphalt itself, but on the sandy shoulder there were indentations, parallel grooves, shallow but recent, where something heavy had been dragged. The tracks curved toward the bushes before ending abruptly where the coffin now rested. This wasn't a random dump site. It had been placed here with intent, perhaps to be retrieved later. A few feet away, a scrap of dark cloth clung to the low branch of a mesquite shrub, fluttering faintly in the breeze. He stepped over, plucking it free with his gloved fingers. The material was smooth and synthetic, torn from something larger. It smelled faintly of oil and sweat, as though it had been part of clothing worn during heavy labor. He pocketed the scrap without hesitation. Back at the coffin, Daniel pulled out his phone and took a series of photographs from multiple angles, ensuring every detail was recorded. He switched next to his body camera, the small red light blinking steadily as it captured both video and audio. This was habit as much as precaution. No matter what happened next, there would be a record of what he had seen, proof that he had not altered or planted anything. He narrated softly for the camera, describing the condition of the coffin, the state of the hinges, the location on the highway. His voice was calm, professional, but inside his mind was already moving ahead to what he needed to do next. Procedure dictated calling it in immediately, requesting backup, and securing the area until investigators could arrive. But procedure also meant inviting others into this discovery, and Daniel was not blind to the reality that not every badge in his department represented integrity. The thought of this coffin and whatever lay inside disappearing before it could be properly examined was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a possibility. He had heard stories, seen cases go cold without explanation, watched as evidence simply vanished into a system that was supposed to safeguard it. Too many times, the trail had ended in the shadows of people with influence and authority. The wind shifted, lifting the edge of the fog for a moment and letting in more light. The coffin's sheen seemed even more unnatural in the brighter glow, as though it had been kept away from the elements entirely until very recently. Daniel's jaw tightened. The decision to open it himself was beginning to feel less like an option and more like an obligation. But he was still cautious. If there was a body inside, tampering could complicate any eventual investigation, and if there wasn't, if it held something else entirely, he needed to be prepared for the consequences of discovering it alone. He moved back to the SUV, retrieving a small pry bar and a flashlight from the storage compartment in the rear. The tools were basic, but they would do for an initial inspection. Before he approached the coffin again, he swept the area one more time, making a slow circle in the fog. The silence was oppressive now, the kind that made every small sound seem amplified. The soft hiss of wind through the brush, the faint creak of his boots as he shifted his weight, even the distant, hollow cry of a bird. It was as if the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Returning to the coffin, he ran his hand over the welded seam again, tracing the line of hardened metal. Up close, he could see tiny spots where the weld had not fully fused, creating hairline gaps. They were too small to see inside, but they suggested the work had been rushed. He found himself picturing the scene: a vehicle pulled over in the dark, the coffin laid out, a man crouched beside it with a welding torch, the hiss and flare of heat against metal, and all the while the anxiety of being discovered. This wasn't the work of someone acting in peace or privacy. It was the work of someone desperate to seal something away quickly and without questions. The realization settled heavily in Daniel's chest. This was not a coincidence, and it was not an innocent mistake. Whatever this was, it had been hidden with care and abandoned with reluctance. That knowledge carried with it a weight of responsibility, one he felt keenly as he stood alone on the fog-shrouded highway. He was the only person who knew about it right now, the only one who had seen the coffin, touched it, studied its every detail. Once he called for backup, or failed to, everything would change. For the moment, though, he kept his decision close. He crouched again, the cold damp seeping through the knees of his uniform pants, and studied the welds in silence. The gold handles caught the dim light of his flashlight, glinting with a false warmth against the dark wood. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, distorted by the curve of the lid. In that warped image, he saw not just himself, but the beginning of something larger, a trail leading away from this lonely roadside toward places and people he could not yet name. The fog thickened again, curling around his legs and the base of the coffin, the world beyond shrinking to a small, isolated stage. Daniel straightened slowly, his mind set. He would see this through, no matter where it led, and he would do it on his terms. The coffin remained before him, mute and unyielding, a silent challenge laid at his feet. Whatever secrets it held, they were his to uncover, at least for now. And in the cold, heavy stillness of the morning, he felt the first stirrings of the danger and intrigue that lay ahead. The coffin's polished surface seemed to absorb the light from Daniel's flashlight, swallowing the thin beam into its deep, reddish hue. He stood over it, his fingers resting on the welded seam, and felt the quiet insistence of his own breathing in the still morning air. The cold dampness of the fog clung to his uniform, beating on the fabric in tiny droplets that soaked slowly into the fibers. Behind him, the patrol SUV hummed faintly, its hazard lights still pulsing in the mist, painting the surrounding haze in rhythmic flashes of red and blue. That strobe made the moment feel surreal, like he was trapped in a scene suspended outside of ordinary time. Daniel crouched, working the pry bar into one of the small gaps where the welding bead hadn't fully sealed the lid. The metal resisted, the crude weld holding stubbornly, but he kept at it, easing the tool in with slow, careful pressure. He knew better than to force it too suddenly. If the coffin did contain something dangerous, the last thing he wanted was to damage it or cause a chain reaction. As the steel of the pry bar scraped softly against the seam, he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, slow but heavy. Finally, the tip found purchase, and with a muted groan of metal, the welded hinge shifted just enough to give him hope. He worked methodically along the line, loosening the joins one by one. The sound was muffled, the fog swallowing it before it could travel far, and yet he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see shapes moving in the mist, drawn toward the noise. No one appeared. The highway remained deserted, its asphalt stretching away into pale nothingness in both directions. When the last weld finally gave way with a faint crack, he paused, taking in the quiet as though bracing for something to happen. His breath condensed in the air as he shifted his grip, setting the pry bar aside. With gloved hands, he pushed against the lid, and it rose slowly, the hinges creaking with reluctance. Inside, the coffin's interior was lined with rich crimson velvet, its folds deep and smooth, as pristine as the exterior. There was no smell of decay, no sign of a body, not even the faintest trace of dust. He frowned, leaning closer. The velvet padding seemed overly plush, the kind of excessive cushioning that looked more decorative than practical. Something about the proportions felt off. In every coffin he had ever seen, there was a certain depth to the interior, a space dictated by the human form it was meant to hold. This one was shallower, much shallower. Daniel reached in, pressing gently on the padding, and was met with a firmness that was entirely out of place. He pushed harder, and the surface yielded just slightly before stopping against something solid. His eyes narrowed. This was not the hollow emptiness of a space awaiting its grim occupant. This was a shell, a disguise for something beneath. Without hesitation, he drew the folding knife from his belt, flicking the blade open with a quiet click. Carefully, he began slicing along one of the seams in the velvet, the fabric parting under the blade to reveal what lay beneath. The flashlight's beam caught on metal, a dull, industrial gray, flat and unadorned. It was a sheet, fitted perfectly to the shape of the coffin's interior. He tapped it lightly with the blade, listening to the solid, muted tone it produced. Steel, not aluminum. Strong enough to protect whatever it concealed. Working with slow precision, Daniel found the small screws anchoring the sheet to the wooden frame. They were hidden in the folds of the lining, but he'd taken apart enough improvised compartments to know where to look. One by one, he loosened them, placing each in a neat row beside him. The smell hit him before he had removed the last screw, a faint but unmistakable chemical sweetness that he knew all too well from narcotics busts. It was the scent of product in high concentration, still sealed, but potent enough to seep into the air the moment its container was breached. With the last screw free, he lifted the metal plate, revealing the compartment beneath. His flashlight illuminated rows upon rows of tightly packed packages, each wrapped in layers of clear waterproof film. The bricks were uniform in size, their surfaces stamped with strange black symbols and alphanumeric codes. He didn't need to test them to know what they were. Cocaine, methamphetamine, or both. Judging by the sheer number of packages, the haul was worth millions. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He'd made drug busts before, but never one this carefully disguised, never one hidden in something designed to repel suspicion so effectively. He set the plate aside and continued to scan the compartment, noting every detail for his body camera. The packages were stacked with precision, the work of someone who had done this many times before. The codes on them weren't random. They were markers for distribution, identifiers for whoever was meant to receive them. Near the foot of the coffin, tucked in between two stacks, was something different. A small plastic capsule, translucent and sealed tight. Inside was a flash drive, the metallic body glinting faintly in the light. He reached for it, feeling the cool plastic under his glove. A flash drive meant records, routes, contacts, maybe even the identities of everyone involved. Or it could be a dead man's switch, something designed to destroy itself or its data if handled incorrectly. He slipped it carefully into a separate pouch on his vest. The weight of the discovery settled over him. This wasn't just a local smuggling job. This was a piece of a larger network, one that extended beyond the reach of any single jurisdiction. Whoever owned this cargo wasn't just moving drugs. They were doing it with the kind of sophistication that required coordination, money, and protection from people in positions of power. Daniel sat back on his heels, scanning the road again. The fog had thinned slightly, the first hints of true daylight beginning to filter through, but the highway was still empty. The quiet was deceptive. Somewhere out there, someone knew this coffin had gone missing from its intended route, and when they realized it wasn't coming, they would come looking. He replaced the metal plate and pulled the velvet back into place, restoring the interior to its original appearance as best he could. He wasn't about to leave the drugs behind, but moving them now alone was out of the question. He needed to think, fast and strategically. Every instinct told him that calling the department directly was dangerous. The list of names he might find on that flash drive could very well include people wearing the same uniform he did. Daniel rose slowly, closing the lid of the coffin and stepping back. The air seemed thicker again, though it might have been the knowledge of what lay inside that made it feel that way. The coffin was no longer just an abandoned oddity. It was a trap, a lure, a message. And now, by opening it, he had crossed a line. He turned toward the SUV, the flash drive secure against his chest. The image of those tightly packed packages burned into his mind. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about survival. His, and maybe that of anyone who tried to bring this operation into the light. When he slid back into the driver's seat, the fog outside seemed to press against the windows, blurring the world beyond. His hand rested on the wheel, but he didn't start the engine just yet. Instead, he sat in the stillness, mapping out his next steps. The path ahead was dangerous, tangled, and far from clear. But one thing was certain. The moment he'd pried open that hidden compartment, his life had shifted irrevocably, and there was no turning back. He finally put the SUV into gear, easing back onto the road. The hazard lights were off now, and the only illumination came from the steady beam of his headlights cutting through the fog. In the rearview mirror, the coffin was already fading into the mist, but its weight remained heavy in his mind. He was carrying its secret with him now, and the knowledge of what he had found was as sharp and unrelenting as the road stretching out ahead. Daniel drove slowly through the fog, the patrol SUV gliding along the slick, dark asphalt as if the road itself had grown cautious. His hands were steady on the wheel, but every nerve in his body was tuned to a sharper frequency now, as though the air around him carried a hum only he could hear. The flash drive felt like it weighed twice as much as its size should allow, pressing against the fabric of his vest in a way that made him acutely aware of it with every movement. The image of the packages stacked neatly inside the coffin replayed in his mind with vivid clarity. He could still smell the faint chemical sweetness clinging to his gloves and the metallic tang that had lingered in the compartment's hidden space. He hadn't yet decided where he would go. His shift was technically over, and protocol demanded that he radio in any major find immediately. But protocol didn't feel safe. Not now. Not when he could practically hear the unspoken warning in his own thoughts. If you call this in, you might never see that evidence again. He had seen it happen before. Smaller seizures that vanished into clerical errors. Drug busts where the weight of the narcotics miraculously diminished between the roadside and the evidence locker. The flash drive in his possession could be even more dangerous than the drugs. It might name names, expose a network, or lead straight to people who were supposed to enforce the law. The road ahead narrowed into a gray tunnel between the fog and the desert scrub. Daniel kept glancing into his mirrors, half expecting to see headlights materializing behind him. The isolation of the highway, which on any other morning might have been a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. There was no one out here to see what happened if another vehicle pulled up alongside him. No witnesses if someone decided that the safest way to protect their operation was to silence the man who had stumbled into it. The thought sent a ripple of tension through him. He forced his breathing into a slow, even rhythm, the way he had learned during his Army days, keeping his mind from spiraling into scenarios he couldn't control. Focus on what you can do now, he told himself. First, secure the evidence. Second, figure out who you can trust. And that second task was the one that tied his stomach into knots. By the time he reached a junction where the highway split toward two different counties, he knew he couldn't risk returning to his own precinct. He turned instead toward a stretch of road that would take him closer to the small, nondescript diner where he knew the cell service was spotty enough to discourage casual listening. It wasn't far from there to the place where he could meet someone outside the chain of command. As he drove, his mind settled on a name. Special Agent John Rivas, a man he had worked with years ago in a joint operation involving weapons smuggling. Rivas had been blunt, methodical, and, most importantly, unafraid to go after people with rank or influence when the evidence demanded it. If there was anyone who could handle what Daniel had found without tipping off the wrong ears, it was him. Still, contacting Rivas wouldn't be simple. Federal lines had their own layers of bureaucracy, and even the wrong secretary or assistant could derail a conversation like this. Daniel would have to reach him directly without leaving a traceable trail of messages. That meant finding a payphone, which in this era was almost as rare as the kind of honest oversight he was hoping for. He pulled into the parking lot of the diner, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and parked in the farthest corner. The fog was thinner here, the low buildings and faint neon of the open 24 hours sign casting a faint orange glow over the lot. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A waitress behind the counter, a man in a trucker's cap nursing a coffee in the corner, and the muted hum of a small television playing the morning news. Daniel ordered a black coffee to go, using the moment to scan the walls for the old payphone he remembered. It was still there, near the restrooms, the handset dangling by its cord, the metal surface scratched with decades of graffiti. With the coffee in hand, he crossed to it and lifted the receiver, listening for the dial tone. He dug into his pocket for coins, then punched in a number from memory, the one Rivas had given him years ago as a "call me here if it's something you don't want on paper" kind of line. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Daniel didn't waste words. He confirmed his identity, said only that he had stumbled on something massive, and that he couldn't go through his department with it. He gave the barest outline, enough to convey the seriousness without spelling out details that could be overheard. Rivas didn't ask unnecessary questions. He told Daniel to meet him in 3 hours at a safe location in a neighboring county, a storage facility they'd used once before during an undercover job. When Daniel hung up, he felt a faint sense of direction returning, though it came with no relief. Now there was a clock ticking in his head, and every minute between now and that meeting felt like an open stretch of vulnerability. He paid for his coffee, left a tip larger than necessary, and returned to his SUV. Driving again, he took the back roads, avoiding the main highway. The terrain here was rougher, the road winding between low hills dotted with scrub and the occasional stand of twisted mesquite. It was the kind of place where a vehicle could follow at a distance without being easily spotted. He checked his mirrors often, the paranoia creeping in despite his efforts to keep it at bay. Once, he thought he saw movement on a ridge, a flash of sunlight off metal, but when he slowed and scanned the area, there was nothing. An hour into the drive, his phone buzzed. The number was blocked. He let it ring without answering, watching as it repeated twice more before stopping. That, more than anything else, made his pulse jump. Very few people had this number, and the ones who did would never use a blocked line unless they didn't want him to know who they were. The road straightened out, and Daniel took the opportunity to pull over onto a dirt turnout, stepping out to stretch his legs while pretending to adjust something in the rear of the SUV. It gave him a chance to look around. There, far back along the road, a vehicle appeared in the haze. Dark, low-slung, unmarked. It was still too far to identify, but it was gaining slowly, steadily. He got back in, started the engine, and pulled onto the road, his pace casual but his mind calculating. He would have to shake them before he met Rivas. Bringing a tail to that meeting would be worse than not showing up at all. The coffin, the drugs, the flash drive, they were valuable enough to risk a man's life over, and Daniel had no illusions that his would be spared out of professional courtesy. The next 20 miles became a quiet duel of pace and distance. The dark vehicle never quite closed in, but it never disappeared either. By the time Daniel turned onto the smaller county road that led toward the storage facility, he could no longer see it in his mirrors, but he didn't believe for a second that he'd lost them entirely. Whoever was behind that wheel was patient, maybe even trained. He reached the storage facility ahead of schedule, its rows of metal doors painted in fading blue, the asphalt between them cracked and sun-bleached. Parking near the far end, he killed the engine and waited. The air was drier here, the fog having burned away under a pale sun, but the stillness was just as oppressive. When Rivas arrived, it was in an unremarkable sedan, his expression grim as he stepped out. The two men didn't shake hands. Daniel handed over the flash drive in silence, explaining only that the drugs were hidden in an abandoned coffin on the highway and that the whole setup stank of organized protected smuggling. Rivas's jaw tightened as he listened, his eyes narrowing at the mention of welded hinges and pristine wood. He promised to keep the drive off official channels until they knew who was compromised. As they parted, Daniel knew the danger hadn't passed. In fact, it had only grown sharper. He had taken the first step in a game where every move would be countered, and now he was in possession of knowledge that could topple more than just a smuggling ring. The real fight, he realized, was only beginning. Daniel left the storage facility with the sense that invisible lines had just been drawn around him. The meeting with Rivas had been short, direct, and devoid of small talk, but it had confirmed what he already knew. This was bigger than one highway stop. He'd placed the flash drive in the hands of someone he trusted, but that didn't mean the threat had passed. If anything, the act of transferring it might have put him in even more danger. Whoever had arranged the shipment in that coffin would notice its disappearance soon, if they hadn't already. The drugs, the welded hinges, the perfect condition of the wood, it all pointed to an operation that wasn't meant to be stumbled upon. And now he'd forced himself into the center of it. The drive back toward his own county felt like a different world from the fog-bound isolation of that morning. The sun had broken through, baking the desert earth and stretching shadows into hard, angular shapes along the road. The light was harsh now, making every rock, every dry blade of grass stand out with startling clarity. There was no comfort in it. The openness only made him feel exposed, a solitary target moving through a vast space with no cover. He scanned his mirrors constantly, noting every vehicle that appeared behind him, every driver who seemed to linger too long in the periphery. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, he knew his absence from the precinct couldn't go unnoticed much longer. His shift had officially ended hours ago, yet he hadn't checked in. Skipping that routine would draw questions, and questions could lead the wrong people straight to the truth. But walking into the building now felt like walking into a nest without knowing which of the shapes inside were snakes and which were harmless. The thought churned in his mind, sour and insistent, as he guided the SUV down familiar streets. When he finally did step through the station's front doors, the change in atmosphere hit him immediately. It wasn't loud, but there was a subtle weight in the air, the kind that came when people were watching without seeming to watch. Conversations dipped in volume when he passed. A few pairs of eyes tracked him across the room before turning quickly away. He'd been in this job long enough to sense when a story had already begun to circulate. Maybe about the morning patrol, maybe about him. One of his colleagues, Officer Mallory, approached with a casual smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The captain wants to see you," he said, voice light but edged with something else, something unreadable. Daniel nodded and walked toward the captain's office, aware of the glances that followed him. Inside, Captain Harris leaned back in his chair, the sunlight from the blinds cutting across his desk in slanted bars. His expression was neutral, but his tone carried that measured weight Daniel recognized from interrogations. "You didn't check in after your patrol this morning. Find anything unusual?" It was a test, Daniel could feel it. Not a genuine inquiry, but a probe to see what he would volunteer. He kept his face impassive, his voice even. Fog was thick out on the state line. Checked a few roadside hazards, nothing requiring immediate report. Harris studied him for a beat too long before nodding. "Try not to make a habit of going dark, Hale. People notice." The words were harmless on the surface, but Daniel heard the undertone. People notice. It wasn't just about procedure, it was a reminder that he was being watched. He left the office with his jaw tight, aware that his margin for maneuvering inside the department had just shrunk. If Harris was compromised, or even just suspicious, then the list of people Daniel could trust here was down to zero. That afternoon, he took the long way home, circling through side streets and alleys to watch for any tail. Twice he caught sight of the same dark sedan from the day before, its tinted windows reflecting the pale glare of the sun. It never got close enough to be obvious, but it never stayed far either. By the third time he saw it, he knew it wasn't coincidence. At home, he didn't linger. He collected a small go-bag he kept for emergencies, slipping it into the back of the SUV. He didn't know if his apartment was being watched, bugged, or both, but the unease that had been gnawing at him since morning told him it was safer to assume the worst. His phone stayed off, battery removed, and he used a prepaid burner he'd picked up weeks ago for personal errands he didn't want logged. The call from Rivas came at dusk. His voice was lower than usual, and there was a new tightness in it. "We've got confirmation. That shipment's part of a network running through 3 states, maybe more. The flash drive links some of your department's upper brass to distribution points, and not just your department." Daniel's hand tightened around the phone. "How bad?" he asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "Bad enough that if you make a wrong move, you'll disappear," Rivas replied. As the street lights flickered to life outside, Daniel felt the shape of the battle closing around him. He wasn't just up against smugglers. He was up against the system itself, or at least the parts of it that had been rotted from the inside. And those parts had reach into law enforcement, into city offices, maybe even into the federal structures meant to dismantle them. The idea that the enemy wore the same uniform, spoke the same oaths, and pretended to stand for the same ideals made his stomach knot. That night, he parked several blocks from where he was staying and walked the rest of the way, eyes scanning the darkened porches and quiet driveways for any sign of movement. He thought of the Coffin, sitting out there on the roadside like a lure, its perfect surface hiding rot and danger beneath. The parallel wasn't lost on him. He was still carrying its shadow, and now it seemed that shadow had grown to stretch over every part of his life. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was shallow and restless, his mind conjuring shapes in the dark and the muffled sound of footsteps just beyond the edge of hearing. Somewhere, out there in the real darkness, men were deciding what to do about him. And he knew that the next few days would decide whether he was going to expose them, or be buried by them. The morning after the call from Rivas came without the comfort of rest. Daniel awoke in the dim light of a rented room whose walls were bare and impersonal, the kind of place chosen for its anonymity rather than any sense of home. The hum of a small refrigerator filled the silence, but it wasn't enough to drown out the awareness that he was being hunted. He moved slowly, methodically, dressing in plain clothes and taking care to check the street from behind the blinds before stepping outside. The air was cool, the faint orange of sunrise brushing the tops of buildings, but the streets were already beginning to stir. He waited until the last pedestrian on the block had passed before locking the door behind him. Rivas's warning still rang in his ears, confirmation of a network that reached through 3 states, names from his own department embedded in the hierarchy of smugglers. Daniel felt the weight of that knowledge in his bones. He understood now that if they knew he still had contact with Rivas, they wouldn't just try to scare him off, they'd eliminate him outright. And yet, the work had to continue. The Coffin on the roadside had been just one shipment, abandoned for reasons he could only guess at. If there was one, there were others, and the only way to dismantle the chain was to find the link still moving. He decided to return to the scene where this had all begun. Part of him needed to see it again, to be sure he hadn't missed anything, and part of him wanted to confirm whether it had been found, or if someone had moved it in the night. Driving there took longer than it should have. He changed routes twice to avoid feeling predictable and kept to smaller roads where he could track anyone following. The habit of checking his mirrors had become second nature now, a constant cycle of glances that marked him as a man aware of the danger breathing down his neck. When the stretch of highway came into view, the sight tightened something in his chest. The Coffin was gone. The patch of dirt where it had rested was disturbed, tire marks scoring the ground, the bushes around it bent further than before. Whoever had taken it hadn't been concerned about subtlety. They'd come in with a vehicle large enough to haul it away, and they'd worked quickly. Daniel walked the perimeter, crouching to study the tracks, feeling the soft give of freshly compressed earth. The impressions were deep, the tread patterns sharp, recent. He took out his phone to snap photos, storing them for later, but he knew these details were just a faint shadow of what had already been erased. He had just started back toward his SUV when he felt the prickling sensation along the back of his neck, the instinctive awareness of being watched. His gaze swept the fog-lifted horizon, and that's when he saw them. 3 figures moving out from the tree line beyond the shoulder, each dressed in dark clothing and masks that hid their faces. They moved in a loose arc, spreading out, not rushing, but closing the distance with the steady confidence of men who knew they had the advantage. Daniel's hand went to his sidearm, the weight of it familiar in his grip, but he kept it lowered for the moment, his stance angled to give him the option of cover behind the SUV. The men didn't speak. One carried a length of metal pipe, another a short, compact shotgun, and the third kept his hands concealed inside his jacket. The message was clear enough. This wasn't a negotiation. The first to break into a run was the one with the pipe, his boots pounding against the gravel. Daniel stepped back quickly, sliding along the side of the SUV and drawing his weapon fully now, his voice cutting through the open space. "Stop where you are." It had the tone of command, years of service behind it, but the man didn't slow. Daniel angled his retreat toward the front of the vehicle, using it as a barrier. The crack of the shotgun shattered the morning calm, pellets tearing into the rear panel of the SUV, the metallic ping of impact ringing in Daniel's ears. Instinct took over. He dropped low, moving to the opposite side of the vehicle and returning 2 quick shots, not to hit, but to make them pause, to force them behind the scant cover of the brush. It bought him seconds, but seconds mattered. He saw now that escape was the only option. Standing his ground here would end with him outnumbered and outgunned. He made a break for the driver's side, the pounding in his chest matched by the rapid scan of his surroundings for any additional threats. Sliding into the seat, he turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The masked men surged forward again, one of them raising his weapon for another shot, but Daniel slammed the SUV into reverse, gravel spraying in a chaotic burst as he spun the wheel. The chase began immediately. In the rearview mirror, the men sprinted toward a dark pickup parked just off the tree line, its engine coughing to life. Daniel pushed the SUV hard, tires gripping the asphalt as he accelerated down the highway, weaving slightly to make himself a more difficult target. The mirror showed the pickup gaining, its headlights bouncing with each dip in the road. He calculated distances, thought about the next turnoff he could use to lose them, but the open stretch ahead offered little in the way of escape. The radio on his dash hissed with static, another reminder that calling for help through the department was off the table. He didn't know which voice might answer with the intention of delaying rescue until it was too late. As the road curved, Daniel spotted a narrow dirt path branching off to the right, partially hidden by a cluster of mesquite. He didn't think. He acted, cutting hard into the turn. The SUV jolted violently, dust and grit clouding the air behind him. The pickup overshot the curve, its tires screeching before it swung onto the path in pursuit. The track wound sharply between low ridges, the kind of terrain that punished speed. Daniel kept his pace just shy of reckless, forcing the truck behind him to make tighter turns. He could hear the engine growl of his pursuers every time they closed the gap, but each twist in the path gave him a momentary lead. Finally, the ridge opened onto a dry creek bed, its pale surface scattered with stones. He guided the SUV down into it, the suspension groaning, and followed the bed until it branched again. He chose the narrower route, knowing the pickup would have trouble navigating the tighter space. It worked. By the time he reached the next rise and climbed out onto a cracked service road, the sound of the other engine had faded. He didn't let himself relax. He drove another mile before pulling off behind a rusted water tower, cutting the engine and sitting in the thick quiet, his pulse still hammering. This wasn't a random ambush. They'd known exactly where to find him, had timed it for his return to the scene. It meant his movements were being tracked more closely than he'd realized. And if they'd been willing to engage him in broad daylight, on a road where anyone could have come along, then their orders had been clear. End the problem before it had a chance to grow. He stayed under the shadow of the water tower until he was certain the road was empty again. The sun was higher now, casting sharp-edged shadows across the landscape, and the heat rising from the ground carried the faint scent of dust and engine oil. When he finally turned the key again, it was with the knowledge that every step from this point forward had to be made as though someone was waiting around the next bend. The net was closing, and the people holding it weren't going to stop. The ride back into the county was long and quiet, but the silence was deceptive, stretched taut like the stillness before a storm. Daniel kept the windows up, the low growl of the SUV's engine the only steady sound as he replayed the ambush in his mind. They had been organized, deliberate, and ready for him. That meant the clock had nearly run out. If they were willing to strike in daylight on a public road, they were growing desperate. Desperation made people reckless, but it also made them dangerous in ways that didn't leave second chances. He pulled into a rest stop 2 towns over, the kind frequented by truckers and early commuters, and parked in a spot where he could see both the highway and the lot's only exit. From here, he used the burner phone to call Rivas. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but beneath it was an urgency that carried through the line. He told him about the ambush, the truck, the masked men, and the fact that the coffin had been removed before he returned. Rivas listened without interruption, his breathing a steady undertone. When Daniel finished, the agent said quietly, "We move tonight." The plan came together in the space of a few minutes, though it was built on weeks, maybe months, of preparation on Rivas's side. They would stage another shipment, one that mirrored the coffin in its appearance and supposed contents, and leak its location through a controlled channel. The bait would be irresistible to the network, especially now that they were scrambling to contain what Daniel had already uncovered. The meeting point for the handoff would be a disused freight yard on the edge of the county, an area easy to secure and hard to reach without being seen. By late afternoon, Daniel found himself driving toward the rendezvous point with the kind of focus that dulled every other sense. The sun was sinking low, turning the sky a muted gold, the freight yard's long shadows stretching like fingers across the cracked asphalt. Federal vehicles had arrived ahead of him, unmarked but positioned with military precision. Agents in plain clothes moved through the space, checking angles, marking positions, and ensuring that once the trap was sprung, there would be no escape routes. The coffin itself, this one empty but weighted to mimic the original, sat in the back of a nondescript delivery van. The hinges and finish were exact, down to the imperfect welds, a replica designed to fool even someone who had worked on the original. Daniel walked alongside it, running a hand over the polished wood, noting how the surface caught the dying light. It was strange, seeing it here in a setting so different from the lonely stretch of highway where he had first laid eyes on it. Back then, it had been an enigma, a question wrapped in silence. Now it was bait, sharp-edged and loaded. Night fell quickly, the yard's few sodium lamps casting cones of dull orange light. From his position near a stack of rusted cargo containers, Daniel watched the entrance, the old chain-link fence beyond sagging slightly where years of neglect had pulled it from its posts. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of oil and metal, the kind of scent that clung to places built for industry but abandoned to time. The first sign of movement came just after 9, a pair of headlights approaching slowly from the road beyond. The vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, rolled to a stop just outside the gate. For a moment, it idled there, the engine's low rumble drifting into the night before the gate creaked open and it slipped inside. Another followed close behind, and then a third, larger truck that made straight for the delivery van. Daniel felt the air tighten around him as the figures stepped out. These weren't street operators. Their posture, the way they scanned the yard, the easy coordination. They were higher up the chain, the kind of men who didn't show their faces unless they were certain of their control over a situation. One in particular caught Daniel's attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the assurance of someone accustomed to giving orders. Even before the light hit his face, Daniel recognized him. Deputy Chief Lawson, one of the department's most respected senior officers, the kind of man whose name carried weight in every law enforcement meeting in the state. Lawson approached the van, exchanging a few low words with another man Daniel didn't recognize. The driver of the van, an undercover agent, nodded and moved to the back, swinging open the doors to reveal the coffin. Lawson stepped forward, resting a hand on the lid, his eyes scanning the yard with casual authority. The signal came in the form of a sharp click over Daniel's earpiece. In an instant, the yard erupted into motion. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the scene in harsh white, and federal agents surged from the shadows, weapons drawn. Commands rang out, echoing off the metal walls, the words, "Police! Federal agents! Hands where we can see them!" cutting through the sudden chaos. Lawson froze, his gaze sweeping the circle closing in around him. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought he might try to talk his way out, but then one of the other men bolted, making a run toward the far fence. That broke the moment. Lawson raised his hand slowly, his expression hardening, but there was no fear in it, only calculation, as though he was already working out the angles for whatever came next. By the time the dust settled, 3 SUVs and the truck had been seized, along with their occupants. Evidence technicians moved quickly, cataloging weapons, cash, and ledgers pulled from hidden compartments. The sight of it should have felt like a victory, but Daniel knew better. This was one piece of a much larger structure, and taking out even a senior officer wouldn't dismantle the whole network. Still, it was a blow, one delivered in the open, in front of witnesses who couldn't deny what they had seen. Rivas approached through the bustle, his face drawn but satisfied. "This will make headlines by morning," he said, his voice low enough for only Daniel to hear. "And it's going to make a lot of powerful people nervous." Daniel nodded, his eyes still on Lawson as the deputy chief was led away in handcuffs, the once impeccable image of authority now reduced to the stark reality of a man caught in his own web. As the night wore on and the last of the suspects were transported away, Daniel lingered in the freight yard. The empty coffin still sat in the van, its polished surface reflecting the harsh lights overhead. He thought of the real one, the drugs, the flash drive now in federal hands. He thought of the list of names Rivas had mentioned and how many were still out there, untouched by this night's events. The fight wasn't over. In truth, it might only be beginning. When he finally climbed into his SUV, the yard was quiet again, the echoes of the operation fading into the background hum of the city. He drove out slowly, the cool night air pressing in through the open window. Somewhere down the line, the network would regroup, adjust, and try to erase the damage. But for now, the secret they had tried to bury in a coffin was out in the open, and Daniel had no intention of letting it disappear again. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out our other videos for more incredible stories, and share this one with your friends.